this evening we are gathered here to attend the second in a series of public activities which St. Bartholomew Church has been organizing to mark its 190th anniversary. We welcome you and we are very pleased to have you with us. So, now the Word of God cautions that unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who builds the house. So with that biblical injunction foremost in our minds, we will therefore call on Reverend Ian Claridge, preaching Charles of St. Bartholomew, to invoke the presence of the Almighty God on this evening's proceedings.
Almighty and gracious Father, we continue to give you thanks for all that you have given to us, life, strength, but most of all, you've given us a sense of who we are and where we can go. As we come this evening to hear about our past and to continue our journey with you in the future, we ask that you be with all who are here as we listen to this presentation, as we study and mark what you have taught us. May we as your people continue to grow in knowledge and love of you, and through knowledge of our past, may we make a brighter and better future for your people through your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
I now call on Brother Eric Goddard, the chairman of the 190th Anniversary Steering Committee, who has been doing an excellent job, we think, in overseeing our planning to formally welcome you. Brother Goddard.
Good evening, my brothers and sisters in Christ. Reverend Canon, Professor Noel Titus, Patron Wilmot Best at Canon, Dr. Jeffrey Mears, the Honorable Robert Bobby Morris and his wife, Mrs. Dr. Christine Morris, Miss Marcia Nurse, other specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is with great pleasure that the priest in charge, Father Ian Claridge, the Church Council, the chairman and members of the 190th Anniversary Committee, and the congregation of St. Bartholomew's Church cordially welcome you as we discuss this very important topic. No easy task, the ministry of the Anglican Church in Barbados. I extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's visiting us for the first time. We at St. Bartholomew are delighted to have you with us this evening. We hope to see you on another occasion and will be pleased to have you worshiping with us at some time in the future. To give some idea of what we are all about, I'll quickly brief you. The St. Bartholomew Church was established in the year 1830 on lands given by Mr. John Newton Lane of Seaville Plantation Christchurch. Its cornerstone was laid on the 24th of August 1830 at a ceremony attended by the Governor and Commander-in-Chief, Sir James Lyon, the Right Reverend William Hart Coleridge Deedy, the first Bishop of Barbados, and the Reverend John Pinder of Calverton College. And in August of 2020, we will be celebrating 190 years. We have decided to celebrate the year of anticipation from August 2019 until August 2020. The celebrations are being held under the theme, Reaching Out, Reaching Lives, Bringing Light to our community. This theme fittingly reflects the evangelizing and outreach of the mission of St. Bartholomew's Church over the past 189 years in shedding the light of Christ on the surrounding communities and organizations in the way of the good news. The fruits of that labor have been reflected not only in the number of priests who have been members of this church's congregation. For example, Reverend Ashley Jones, Reverend Rami Mosley of blessed memory, Reverend Canon Dr. Jeffrey Mears, Canon Noel Armstrong, and our own patron, Wilmot Best. but is evident in the relative calm of the communities which we serve, and long will remain this way. Tonight's lecture seeks to put in focus the significant work of the Anglican Church in evangelizing and education in Barbados. In this regard, we are indeed grateful to the Reverend Canon Professor Noel Titus, who has gratefully accepted our invitation to enlighten us on the ministry of the Anglican Church in Barbados. He has a passionate commitment to this topic, and I'm sure his delivery will expand our horizons on the work of our church, and most importantly, will help in reinvigorating and reshaping the missions in our community. We invite you to fully participate in the discussions as we delve into the history of the Anglican Church in Barbados. However, before we begin, I invite Mr. Orlando Scott, our co-chair, to present the bio on Canon Titus. I want to thank each and every one of you for attending. Once again, a heartfelt welcome.
I'm deeply honored to introduce our distinguished speaker, Reverend Canon Professor Noel Titus. Reverend Canon Titus, who held the post of Principal of Codrington College from 1983 to the year 2005, holds a BA Honours and MA in Theology from Durham University, England, and an MA and PhD in History from the University of the West Indies, and is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He served as lecturer at Codrington College in the periods 1972 to 1975, 1981 to 1983, and Professor of Church History in 2003. He was appointed to the post of Principal of the College in 1983. Professor Titus is the author of the following books: The Development of Methodism in Barbados from 1823 to 1883, Conflicts and Contradiction, the Introduction of Christianity to the 16th Century Caribbean, The Amelioration and Abolition of Slavery in Trinidad from 1812 to 1834, and Mission in a Volatile Society. He has edited 2 books, Church on the Edge and Ministry in Caribbean Perspective. He has also edited various articles and chapters in books. Apart from his roles as lecturer, writer, and editor, Professor Titus has served as rector of St. Saviour in Correct, Trinidad, St. Andrew in Scarborough, Tobago, and St. Lawrence Church in Barbados. Professor Titus has also given service to the Caribbean on several boards and organizations. He has served as chairman of the Caribbean Association of Theological Schools, 1986 to 1989, and 1995 to 2005. He's been president of the Association of Caribbean Tertiary Institutions from 2002 to 2005, member of the Executive Committee of the World Conference of Association of Theological Institutions, a program of the World Council of Churches. He has been chairman of the board of the Barbados Accreditation Council, rector, council member, Diocese of Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados, and member of commission of the CPWI. As this brief introduction has illustrated, and I can tell you if he were to give me the full CV, I would be lecturing to you. Reverend Canon Professor Noel Titus has given distinguished service to the church in his native Tobago, Trinidad, Barbados, the Caribbean region, and the world. And it is not a difficult task for him to address us on the subject, no easy task, the mission of the Anglican Church in Barbados. Let's give Canon Titus a warm welcome.
It is indeed for me a great honor to be able to come and say a little on this topic. I cannot, in the course of one lecture, deal with the whole history of the Anglican Church in Barbados. So I've selected certain areas where I think I can do something that is very helpful. I'm also concerned not to fill you with a whole list of things that the Anglican Church did, but perhaps preferably to help you to understand the context in which the church had to function and what it meant to do the things that the church did. I hope I will be successful in doing that. It has been commonplace for the Anglican Church to be chastised for failing to perform to the satisfaction of writers or speakers. The condemnation relates to two things. One of these is the abusive description of it as the planter's church, a description which may serve to perpetuate bias, built exclusively on the extent of the inaction of the clergy before the arrival of a bishop in the island. This castigation of the church is unfortunate, since it does not look at the context in which the church functioned. It is unfortunate also in that, notwithstanding the abundance of evidence to the contrary, many writers on the West Indies limit planter hostility to their dealings with the dissenting missionaries. The other thing is the lack of performance of members of the clergy in relation to the slave population. From our perspective, it is not unreasonable to expect more of those who held such office. However, the experience of clergy was not unlike that of missionaries, where clergy attempted their unwanted work. The slave owners did not want interference with their slaves. Even here, one important issue has never been looked at, and that is that the churches, all of them, accepted the system of slavery. In presenting this narrative of the church's ministry, it is my hope that we shall gain a better perspective of the actual task. There are a number of issues which need to be borne in mind. In the earliest days of Anglican operations in this island, its ministers were essentially freelance operatives. They often moved at will from one island to another, or even to America, as circumstances suited them. While early instructions they received urged governors to pass laws to control the manner of life of settlers in their colonies, there is little evidence that these settlers were interested in anything other than wealth and the comfort which it brought them. As a result, there was no body, no organized institution called church as we know it today. Between 1629 and 1641, the island was divided into 11 parishes. This division represents a replication of the English structure, facilitating the civil operations of the parish, while making some provision for its ecclesiastical functions. In doing the latter, it provided for a church building, a minister, and emoluments for him, and these provisions were to be made available by the vestry, another English institution. Members of the vestry were residents and ratepayers in the parish rather than members of the church. In actual fact, they were not required to be members. The qualifications for election to the vestry were the same as for election to the House of Assembly. Ownership of a minimum of 10 acres of land or property in town with a fixed rental value. The same class of persons fixed the level of emoluments for the clergy, which were often irregularly paid. A letter of 1637 by Thomas Lane reported the arbitrary approach of vestries in their dealings with clergy. What seems fairly clear is that the planters, the vestrymen and assemblymen controlled the lives of the ministers. This control became a major challenge early in the 18th century when a rector of St. Michael assumed the function of commissary in the island. William Gordon's commission as commissary of the Bishop of London gave him authority and, in inverted commas, coercive power over the affairs of the church, and thereby shifted control of that institution from the planter's hands to an ecclesiastical official. The power of the commissary had been barred in Jamaica by an act of 1681, so that the Bishop of London had no supervisory authority in that island. In Barbados, Governor Lowther and the legislature fought hard to ensure that the commissary had no opportunity to function as commissaries did in England. This right to control is the rare sense in which there can be said to have been a planter's church. A church controlled by the planter elite, and that control persisted on the basis, if you will, that he who paid the piper called the tune. Functioning as a church was no easy task, and the basic problem for the dissenters was essentially the same, that they were fiercely loyal to their missionary authorities in London and could not be controlled by the planters. Certain realities seemed to follow from all of this. The Anglican Church in Barbados, as in the entire Western Hemisphere, was devoid of episcopal supervision. The commissaries did not hold office regularly, and when they did, were merely correspondents of the Bishop of London. The bishop could not appoint ministers to parishes because that was the prerogative of the governor. In fact, beginning about 1664, instructions given to governors authorized them to recruit ministers for the parishes, so that it was now being acknowledged that the character of the minister was a reflection of the governor who appointed him. What has not yet been recognized is that the Anglican Church is the only one which had no control over the appointment of its ministers. Even the Bishop of London, once he had ordained someone and given a license to a minister, had no say as to where that person was appointed. And this is one of the things why it was no easy task. A further indication of the difficulty of the task for members of the clergy has to do with the large number of slaves in the island. Ministry to these persons, however well-intentioned, was negatively impacted by the existing legislature and legislation. At a very early stage, slaves across the West Indies were regarded as property. Barbados was one of 2 jurisdictions in this region to declare specifically that slaves were to be considered real estate. Real estate. In the estimation of planters, property was inviolable, not to be trespassed on or damaged by anyone from the outside. This explains why brutality by a master against his slaves was not viewed with the seriousness we expect today. He was not guilty. Only the other person who damaged his property. So a master who killed his slave could be acquitted. Anyone else committing the same offense was guilty of destroying his property and was fined. The planter was dealing with his slaves as property or real estate, not with them as persons. In addition, planters had long debated not only whether a Christian could be made a slave, but whether a slave could be made a Christian. These questions represented virtually two sides of the same coin, and the planter's conclusion was negative in both regards. With that conclusion, and with the legal understanding of the slaves as property, slave owners erected an impregnable barrier to ministry to the slaves. This affected both ministers of the Anglican Church as well as the evangelical missionaries, and partly represents the objection later made to the strange bequest of Christopher Codrington to have his slaves cared for. His desires were never fully carried out, in part because of the opposition of local slave owners. In the same vein, William Marshall Hart was treading on dangerous ground in trying to instruct slaves without the consent of their masters. In every case, instructions given to ministers who worked in the West Indies demanded that they did not act without the specific approval of such masters. This represents essentially the prevailing outlook when, in 1823, a meeting of clergy determined to start a program for the instruction of slaves in the island. The group were of the view that while individuals had done some work, much more could be done if they acted as a body. And so an initiative was launched with planter support for the instructions of slaves in Barbados. Ironically, this initiative took place at approximately the same time that William Marshall Hart was being harassed and tried in the courts for his work among slaves in St. Lucie. The program was limited in its scope, but antedated some of the Moravian and Methodist work. When Bishop Coleridge arrived in 1825, the report which was presented to him showed Anglican ministry on 152 estates, involving the participation of a number of lay catechists as well as clergy. This initiative was almost certainly a response to the British policy of slave amelioration begun in 1823. Work among slaves had been spasmodic from the time of Bishop Gibson in 1723, and as recently as 1808, Hart had begun with little success teaching slaves in St. Joseph the duties and principles of Christianity. It is my belief that Hart, who had a title to become curate of St. Michael, changed his mind after meeting Bishop Porteous in London. As a result, he was released by William Garnet, rector of St. Michael, to enable him to function on the Codrington estates. The arrival of Bishop Coleridge in 1825 would signal a new beginning in the work of the church. A former General Secretary of the SPCK, Coleridge seems to have brought with him something of the missionary spirit of that institution. In his approach to the slave population, he anticipated some of the immediate post-emancipation concerns. A great deal of his attention was directed at first towards the construction of chapels of ease, since he considered that the capacity of the existing parish churches and the two chapels, All Saints and Society, fell far short of the target population. In short order, certainly in Christ Church, St. Bartholomew and St. Lawrence, to name a few, who were erected, with similar chapels in other parishes. He also started the process of building schools, as well as using the chapels as schools. In the building of chapels and schools, Coleridge obtained the assistance of planters, some of whom he admitted had been hostile to the instruction of slaves in the period before emancipation. Anglican work in Barbados was more extensive than occasional writings tend to indicate. When Bishop Coleridge assumed office in 1825, he did so in the context of the slave amelioration program being promoted by the British government. Part of that program, such as was implemented by Fiat in Trinidad, required that slaves be instructed in the Christian religion to enable them to give evidence in court. This was a serious threat to the slave owners, because now they were likely to be convicted for serious crimes against slaves. Previously, the latter could not give evidence in court against whites, so that the inhumanity of the latter often went unpunished. The program also promoted various forms of social improvement, including the right of the slaves to marry and to preserve their unity as families. The right claimed by slave owners to separate families by sale was now also threatened. Another area of change involved helping slaves to develop a sense of thrift through the establishment of savings banks. This was one of the planks of the system introduced in Trinidad in 1824. One cannot say whether this aspect of the program influenced Coleridge. However, with a similar interest in mind, he promoted the establishment of friendly societies not only in Barbados, but in other parts of his extensive diocese. In a statement made in the mid-1830s, he explained that these societies offered the clergy an area of great usefulness. They were intimately connected with religion, and so the privilege of membership was made, and I quote, dependent on piety and good morals, end of quotation. Coleridge further explained that the habits of industry and frugality, effective relief to the sick, maimed, aged, or in any way distressed member, made the introduction of such societies of the utmost importance in every well-ordered parish. Branches were started in several parishes, so that by 1839 there were some 22 of them in the island, with a membership of 2,574. The main branches were in St. Mary's and St. Paul's. The branches of the same society in St. John did not last very long. The setting of these churches suggests that they were not wealthy, but were located among some of the poorest classes in the society. The establishment of these friendly societies was accompanied by strict rules, offering members, for example, a bonus for children born in wedlock. The members of these societies came largely from the slave population, and this requirement was part of the promotion among that class of marriage, a prohibited area of social life denied to them by law. This arrangement had its problems, the fact of polygamy among the slaves being the key one. Taking a pastoral approach, Coleridge urged what might seem a surprising way of dealing with the issue. Recognizing the cultural background of polygamy from which the Africans came, he advised the concentration of monogamous teaching on the young, as it was unwise to require the older Africans to abandon all but one of their wives. This writer has seen no report of the responses to this directive. In a circular letter sent some time previously, he had also asked the clergy to cease distinguishing color and condition in their publication of banns of marriage. That circular was in February 1833. This was one step in his effort to break down the wall of prejudice which had been strongly built in the island. It was a short step from this to the decision, inspired by Coleridge, to grant plots of land to slaves on the upper estates of the upper plantation of the Cotrington estates, provided they were married. By this time, the SPG had also made the marriage of the slaves an obligation on the estates. Beginning with Coleridge, a major part of the church's ministry lay in the field of education. It must not be assumed, however, that efforts at educating the slave population had begun with his arrival. Shortly after assuming office in the island, Coleridge received reports about work done among the slaves. While the work was obviously of a limited nature, in that it excluded reading and writing, it showed a wide network of contact with the enslaved population. There was work, as I said earlier, on 152 plantations by representatives of the church using clergy and catechists. Unfortunately, the report does not say when this work started, but it may fairly be assumed that it was a recent event. Persons such as W.M. Hart were pioneers in this area, Hart having started in St. Joseph with little success and gone on to St. Lucy, where he was tried and convicted for failing to preserve the distinction between masters and slaves in the church of his parish. Others in the island, whatever their personal disposition, were not inclined to be as forthright as Hart. However, Since slave amelioration was being promoted in the British colonies in the 1820s, with its emphasis on religious education, those planters who may have been covertly sympathetic towards slave education joined the clergy in devising this restricted program, a program essentially of teaching on the church catechism. Planters had previously opposed any education of the slaves, their opposition being visited most severely on the dissenters whom they could not control. The Anglican clergy they easily controlled, since, as Sir Keith Hunt described it, they were their paymasters. The abolition of slavery, like the amelioration program, was predicated on the education of those intended to be beneficiaries. In the case of the ex-slaves, education was to prepare them for full freedom. Towards this end, the British government provided funds to assist those missionary bodies already functioning in the West Indies to enable them to undertake this responsibility. In the provision of schools, the government undertook to provide 2/3 of the cost of building, while each missionary body provided 1/3. It stands to reason that any denomination which could raise the requisite amount for school building would be in a better position to receive funds from the education grant. With resources from the Church Missionary Society and the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel at its disposal, the Anglican Church was best placed to carry out its educational work. The quantum received does not tell the whole story. It is the 2/3 raised, it's the 1/3 raised that enabled the Anglican Church to receive the lion's share of the grant. Visitors to the island in 1837 noted the efforts of the church in the education of the former slaves. All of them commented on the change that had come over the planters since the passage of the abolition of slavery. There was now no limitation of the program to rote learning, even though there was a concern to ensure that the freedmen were not drawn away from estate or other manual labor. The number of schools and the number of those being educated continued to rise with the financial backing of the funds provided by government. Having schools was one thing. Having well-run schools and quality teachers was quite another matter. In every denomination, it was customary to recruit as teachers those persons who were primarily committed members. However, such commitment was no guarantee of pedagogical ability or of knowledge of the subject matter of the curriculum. This was the issue which faced Richard Rawle, recently appointed principal of Codrington College, when he assumed office at that institution in 1847. Rawle was not only interested in having large numbers of school children, he was particularly anxious to have as teachers persons who were competent to teach. In a plan which he devised for education in Barbados, he wrote as follows: "Schoolcraft requires an apprenticeship to be served and a course to be gone through of preparatory practice. Even of well-educated men and women, few are to few are fit to undertake the education of children. The possession of knowledge and good habits is a distinct thing from the power of communicating them to others. This principle seemed to guide his program of instruction for teachers. And so he began offering lectures to teachers to improve their teaching skills and their management of schools. At this time, the legislature in 1846 had made provision for only £750 per year for education, £375 for the half year, July to December of that year. The Anglican Church in 1845 administered 59 schools, and operating these cost more than the sum voted by Parliament. Rawls' efforts resulted in the rise of a body of teachers better able to perform their tasks, and this showed itself in later years when schools were subjected to annual inspection by the newly formed Education Committee. The emphasis for the Anglican Church, as Bishop Parry admitted, had to be on training local personnel. Recruiting from England entailed risks, which he did not identify, and great expense. Rawls' work in education was continued by other principals and was recognized by the naming of the first Teachers' College after him, the Royal Institute, located on the Codrington compound. This antedated by many years the foundation of the Eardiston Teachers' College in 1948. As early as 1835, the Sterling Report had pointed to the need for secondary education to be available for persons of all classes and colors. This issue was taken up only late in the century after the Mitchinson Report was published. The Codrington Grammar School and Harrison College were already in existence as private institutions. Sterling proposed schools that were public and not under the superintendence of any church. This was reinforced by the Mitchinson Report, which suggested 2 grades of advanced education for pupils able to undertake it. Mitchinson was to make a significant contribution to education in his efforts to have Codrington affiliated with an English university, and the University of Durham was preferred to London University, preferred because they wanted one in which divinity was a major part of what went on at the university. At the time, that affiliation provided opportunities for persons in Barbados and beyond to receive university degrees without having to travel to England, which only a few could afford to do. The training omitted 2 of the more popular areas of professional development, law and medicine. It did, however, provide a solid base in classical studies and mathematics, which enabled persons to teach in secondary institutions without excluding theological studies and ministry, for which Principal Rawle had fought with Sir Robert Boucher Clarke. One of his first acts on arrival in the island was to appoint a young clergyman to minister to the prisoners. This, according to H.N. Coleridge, was the Reverend John Packer. I have had very great difficulty being able to verify this. If this appointment took place in 1825, during which time Coleridge was in the West Indies, it was a remarkable indication of pastoral care on the part of the bishop. But it was not a single act, for Quaker abolitionists visiting some 12 years later noted the performance of such duties at that time by the Reverend W.M. Hart. The same writers also commented on the existence of prejudice within individual congregations, singling out St. Mary and St. Paul's for commendation in reducing prejudice. But it must be admitted that they did not go to many Anglican churches, as they were also obligated to visit churches of other denominations. An interesting observation by a group of abolitionists indicated a visit to St. Matthew's Church, where the entire choir consisted of colored members. One is left to wonder whether other churches in the island were similarly venturesome. What we have seen so far might be regarded as individual activity, and that is basically correct. The work of the church was promoted through its leadership, and that was true of all churches. It was the leader who took the initiative and steered his church. This, of course, raises questions about those in leadership positions. Bishop Coleridge did a lot in Barbados, but for some reason was not well regarded by some in the colored community. There was lingering suspicion about his freedom from prejudice, notwithstanding his support of Hart. Bishop Mitchinson was far in advance of many and contributed to education in the island. Unfortunately, he had a remarkable inclination to offend when he did not need to, and he attracted negative responses. Unlike them both was Richard Rawle, showing signs of selflessness and determination as he worked to improve education. In looking at these persons, we might well learn valuable lessons for our times and for the work and leadership of our church. I thank you.
I saw you smile when I spoke about heart, so I think we would like to expand on that a little.
Why did you ask me that question first? Forgive me, because the case against Hart was decided here in Barbados, and Coleridge did not support it, and Coleridge undertook to write to the colonial office, hoping to have it reversed. I have questions about terminology. If you say a man is pardoned, you say he's guilty. You cannot pardon an innocent person. And I've always felt that it is a pity that the colonial office did not state that Hart had been exonerated and reverse the decision. But that's only me. There were some planters, and in what I've written about Hart elsewhere, I detailed some of what went on, because although the parish, the vestry of St. Lucy, engineered this court case, Hart continued to work in St. Lucy until 1832, when he was moved to St. Mary's, and especially the family of the Leacocks. There was a vicar of St. Leonard's, Amble J. Leacock, who was from that St. Lucy family, and the Leacocks were among those who continued to support Hart. So I don't think that all the lay persons were against missionaries or anybody who worked with the slaves. Some of them as Thome and Kimball, who wrote a lot about emancipation, they showed that there were quite a number of people who were covertly, and I use that word deliberately, covertly, supporters of the education of slaves. Let me deal with the second question. I think that when Coleridge came, his concern, as I said, quoting something he said, was that the 11 parish churches and the 2 chapels could not minister or could not contain the number of persons that there were in Barbados. There was a need for more churches, and so he started building these chapels of ease. But he was also concerned about education, hence his attempt to build schools just about everywhere he could. Right? So building the churches and building the school was one of the things. The first question you asked about the governors appointing clergy, that's a fact. I think a governor of Jamaica was the first person to have that in his instructions, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the one whose name is part of Barbados history, Mortiford. He was the first one to get those instructions clearly set out, telling him to recruit clergy. Many of the persons appointed by governors were far from adequate in a lot of ways. Governor Park, who lost his life, I think he was assassinated, he appointed just about anybody who was willing to do, whom he could put there. He was a fairly rotten type of person. And there were other governors who just appointed anybody. I came across recently one in the Bahamas, where a man called Rogers, who was the secretary of the governor, was appointed to a parish and sent to England to be ordained. These are the kinds of things that are, and that's why I made the point that one of our problems in the early days was that the church did not appoint its ministers. They were appointed by persons like governors, and not many of them were necessarily persons interested in the church. When you read the reports about what's his name, Atkins and Dutton, who were here in Barbados, the conflict that you see between what they are saying about the church, and then read about Jonathan what's his name, Lynch in Jamaica. When you read the reports, they are telling you different things, and you're seeing some unsatisfactory things coming in.